tall, and what if it's made out of foam rubber, you know, and they can think out of the box. So there was a study done with 1,500 kindergartners, and they were trying to test their ability to think in divergent ways. And at the end of this test, what percentage of them do you think came up as genius levels in divergent thinking?
All of them.
Close, 98% genius level. So they came back in 5 years, and they tested the same group of kids, and it dropped to 50%. And they came back in another 5 years, and it dropped further. So we have a natural tendency, it seems, to lose our ability for divergent thinking. Meanwhile, isn't that the skill we're kind of looking for in the world out there, is this creative thinking, to think about things differently? And you may say, well, maybe this is natural. Maybe we just kind of naturally lose this with age. But I would actually say maybe these children are environments that are not promoting being able to take risks and be able to make failures, perceive failures, and be able to pick themselves up from that and move on. And I like this quote here, the only sure way to avoid making mistakes is to have no new ideas. And so, can they not make rational decisions? I'd actually say they're more wired to make decisions much better than we are. They may not look like the decisions we make, but that's because they're wired to think about many different possibilities to do them. So, I'm not saying being wrong is the same thing as being creative, but if you're not prepared to be wrong, how are you going to come up with anything original? And our environments, certainly in the traditional model, are not set up to allow kids to, in a safe environment, make mistakes and use that information and move on from them. Unsupervised children will behave badly. So, again, I'll use the Sudbury Valley School example. I'll probably overuse it. But in that school setting of 200 kids, there's actually very little to no bullying going on there. And I think what's going on there is because they feel empowered in that environment, because they're setting the rules, and they feel like they can actually do something about any kind of violation of the rules, and they are taking an active part in their society. In a traditional model, there was a study that was done that said, basically, in the United States, every 30 minutes, there's an instance of bullying going on in a traditional school, and each instance lasts about 7 minutes long. And about 10% of those times is reported to somebody, an authority figure, and of those 10%, only 2% result in some sort of consequences. And I think we've all experienced this, and we've all seen this, that the children don't feel empowered. They don't feel like they can actually make any change in their environment. But once you empower a child to actually, and they have this internal barometer of what's right and wrong, but they become apathetic if they feel like there are no natural consequences. So in these models, the children actually feel like they are part of this system. So here's the big one, right? So people say, okay, I get all this, but you're definitely not going to allow kids to bring video games to school, right? There's no way, because they'll just play video games all day long. Well, again, in the Sudbury Valley School, they let these kids play video games. They actually have dedicated a basement for these kids to go down and they play video games. And they've actually found that something interesting happens is a lot of these kids that kind of find themselves conglomerating in these video gaming groups are more shy type personalities. And these gaming groups are a really safe, comfortable way to kind of get together and socialize. And so they're honing their social skills. And they get comfortable there. Eventually they kind of get other interests. They might be girls. And they come up out of the basement and they start to shower. And they get out of their pajamas. And they engage in other interests. And they get involved in other things. They become bored of doing the same thing over and over again. And then other kids use it as a decompression tool. And this is actually a very interesting thing that happens in these type of schools, is if you take a child who's been in a traditional model and you put him in these democratic schools, there's this decompression time that happens. It's almost like these kids need to debug themselves for a while. And the longer they've been in a traditional model, the longer they are likely to do what we perceive as nothing, playing video games. So it's almost like they're decompressing, they're flushing the old system out of it. In video games, let's be honest, is kind of what fishing was, 40 years ago. It's the pastime. You know, people used to go fishing, and that good-for-nothing kid just fishes all day long. It's kind of the same thing, right? And in Sudbury, there's actually a cool story of when they first started. There was a kid they brought in from a traditional model, and he was used to being told what to do all day long, and they said, do whatever you like. And he said, cool, I'll do nothing. And they said, that's fine. And so he went and started fishing, and he recruited a friend who was there who also liked fishing. And they read a lot about fishing, and they got really good at fishing. And they did this for years. I'm talking like 4 years. They fished every day. They came in and they fished. And they were allowed to do so, but they were very engaged in fishing. They loved it. And then one day they stopped. They stopped fishing. And they re-emerged into society, and to this day, one of those kids is a computer programmer, and the other one is a musician. And the reality is, whether we want to believe it or not, is they're not going to play video games all the time for the rest of their lives. They feel like they're going to play video games for the rest of their lives, but they're really not going to. And here's the liberty thing. If they are not bothering anybody, why are we bothering them with them? Why can't they do it? All right, here's one that actually bothers me the most. The lecture model is most effective. So, I think this was probably true back in the day when we didn't really have access to information. And you go to the schoolhouse to get information because, you basically were working all day long, kind of the Laura Ingalls style. But now we're surrounded by information. We have more information than we can possibly process. So you may say, well, that's why we have the lecture model, right? Because there's so much information, our kids are so overstimulated, we actually need to filter this information out for them so that they can hone in what's actually really important. So I have 3 problems with that. One is, that says, if we're filtering this information out, that says we know what curriculum to teach our kids to prepare them for 10 years from now. And we don't. We really don't. If you went back 10 years ago and said, teach me everything I need to know for the next 10 years, you would certainly have gotten it wrong. There's just no way to plan for it. A curriculum is meaningless now for the future. It's just changing too quickly. And then if you're filtering this information, it's a bit subjective, right? And this is probably going to hurt some people's feelings, but the reality is, there's an individual, or a group of individuals, and they pick out things that they feel is important. And you hear this a lot. So let's say you think art history is really super important, and you've gotten a lot out of art history, and it's changed your life. And so you automatically think, well, we need to teach other people art history because it's meaningful and it's really helped me a lot. But that's really subjective, right? And the reality is if art history has value, other people are going to study it. And you'll say, oh no, but they don't know that it has value. We need to help them with that. We need to help them get there. Well, if it has value, people will find it. Then that's a true free market liberty stance on that. And if it doesn't have value, and this is going to hurt your feelings if you love art history and it's something that's starting to it may become obsolete. And so be it. But it doesn't give us the right to shove it down their throats just because somebody or a group of people thinks it's important. And then finally, what bothers me about the pre-digestion of information is it destroys the value of discovery. That moment where you've found something on your own and you figured it out. When you're feeding it to somebody, you're destroying that for them. You're taking that opportunity away from them. And then more broadly, the broadcast method, as I like to call it, this lecture model, we now know that there are different ways to learn. There's the auditory way, the kinesthetic way, and the visual. Auditory works really well for the broadcast method because you're listening to it. And then you've got the ADD kids out there that are kinesthetic learners. A lot of the times they like to be part of it. They don't have to be ADD, but they're most likely kinesthetic learners. They want to be active with their material. And then you've got the visual learners, the ones that need to see it to be able to process it. And here's the real one. Children don't want it. They don't want to learn that way. It doesn't mean anything to them. It's not what's happening in the world around them. It's not meaningful. You put them in these classrooms, and it's not representative of what they're seeing in their worlds. It has no interest to them. It's not relevant to them, and it's not useful to them. Age grouping works for teaching. So this is what we do. We try to get this information into them, and we try to do it at the right times and the right age groups. And It just makes sense to do it that way. So when does this happen at any other time in our lives? When you first got your job, did they group you into a building with other 21-year-olds? It just doesn't happen. It's just not natural. It's not the reality. We're mixed with other people, you know, from 21 up until, you know, hopefully you get exposure to people in their 70s and 80s. It's just not natural. And here's the real problem is, if you get kids in a traditional model that are with the same type of kids, that have the same experience and the same information, they don't really have any way to differentiate themselves from one another. And we somehow feel like we want to be able to do that. We want to be able to label each other. So if we're all kind of homogeneous in a way, you create this really unnatural and unhealthy labeling system. You're the best dresser. You're the athlete. You're the geek. You're the worst dresser. You're the poor kid. You're the rich kid. And they've actually found that these labels actually stick with us well into our adult years, and we still have that way deep into our psyche, and it's pretty toxic. Another thing is, peer mentoring works. I actually had somebody say to me about Montessori once. They said, yeah, you know, I don't know about that Montessori thing. I just don't like the idea of a third grader teaching a first grader. But when you've ever seen that happen, like if you've seen another kid teach another kid how to ride a bike, they're closer to it. They've just experienced it. They know how to talk about it. I mean, if you try to teach a child as an adult how to ride a bike, I mean, if you have a nice child, they'll like try to make you feel like you're actually helping, but you're not. And my children aren't those children, and they'll tell us that we have no idea what we're talking about. But as soon as you get another kid in there, it's just kind of like, you know, there's respect, and they know how to communicate with each other, and peer mentoring just works. It works with us. All right. So here's the last one. So let's say we believe all this stuff, but the problem is diplomas get you to college, get you to a job, and it gets you to be successful. Well, I'm going to throw some graphs at you here. So this is the most threatening part, right? Especially to someone like me. I mean, I wanted to be a marine biologist when I was a kid. Right? That seemed like fun, but it makes sense. You know, I should go into finance. I should be a business person. I went and got my MBA, did all the right things. And so I don't want to hear that everything I did is all for naught, that everything's changing around me. But the reality is, it is changing. And so for the first time ever in history, a majority of jobless workers, 25 and over, have attended some college. And so these lines are crossing. It's not, you know, and going to get a college degree, it helps still. But it's certainly not the guarantee of success that we were taught when we were kids. And we don't like to talk about that, right? So let's say the ROI stinks. Let's say you lose money on it. There's something like really pure about going to academia and getting an education. You can't go wrong investing in yourself in that way. And it's just something a little corrupt about talking about that, you know, college is really kind of a waste of time and money. Well, that ROI doesn't look so good anymore, right? And we know that inherently. We don't really want to talk about it. It doesn't feel good. But what's this going to look like? This goes to 2010. What's it going to look like in 2020? And we feel it. If anybody out here has financial advisors, it's pretty appalling.